That strange compulsion, isn't it? I'm in my 80s and I think I should know about Islam. Why? Why? It's a fancy. It's a feeling that I'm still engaged with the world.
Good morning. My name is Richard Holloway, as has just been announced, and it's an enormous honor to be here to interview Joan Bakewell about her new book, a brilliant account of moving house to prepare for the final phase of life, which we're both kind of getting close to.
Indeed.
It's hard to know where to begin introducing Joan Bakewell because she has packed so much into her long and distinguished career. She's a journalist, a broadcaster with a still active career. She's a Labour peer and co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Humanist Group. Interesting, because she used to do a lot of programs on religion and whether it meant anything. She's obviously decided, well, she's decided that. Her latest book, she's written many books, but her latest book is a lovely, resonant, for me, the same age as Joan, a nostalgic book about getting ready for the end. It's called The Tick of Two Clocks, A Tale of Moving On, and we're here to discuss it today. So please welcome Joan Bakewell back to the Edinburgh International Book Festival.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you. It's great to be back. Wonderful.
Joan, your book is the story of the decisions you had to make about finding and moving into what will be your last home, your future prepping. But I want to begin by getting you to read a solid chunk from your book, chapter 2, page 20, which is your house telling us its history. It's a wonderfully imaginative thing. Read us a chunk.
The two clocks refer to the two time scales. I lived in my big Victorian house for 53 years. And it came time to change. So when I make that into an account of for my book, I thought I would give the house its own voice. So this chapter is written by the house. Here it is. Here I stand, a tall house in a square in Primrose Hill. I arrived in what felt like a frenzy of building, going on around the time that Lord Palmerston was Prime Minister and Florence Nightingale was off to the Crimea to see what difference she could make. Quite a lot, it turned out. But news travelled slowly. No one around here paid much attention unless they had soldier sons fighting. Even for them, it was too distant to count. People's interests were mostly local. In the 170 years since then, I've lived through some changes and families. The most recent lot stayed the longest, some 50-odd years. The young family arrived with a small baby, an Austrian au pair, and little money. But they were very happy. They loved my tall windows and high ceilings, didn't worry about carpets or furniture much. He had a BBC job, so they looked to be settled and even prosperous one day. In the end, it didn't quite work out like that. After a good few years, there were bouts of shouting and hurried phone calls taken in secret. Eventually, there was a divorce. But by then, they'd had a terrific 17 years, drinks parties with lots of smoking, ashtrays in every room, children's birthdays in fancy dress, dinners that were all lit candles and fancy menus. I came into my own too, admired, even envied. I felt it was my heyday. I was given listed status in the 1970s when I became part of a conservation area, so I couldn't be demolished. My walls can't even be tampered with too much, or the heritage folk will kick up a fuss. Fortunately for my family, they had turned my attic into a bedroom before the rules applied. It meant that their teenage daughter could shut herself away there and play rock music very loud. But that's decades ahead.
Lovely.
So that's the house I left. That was the house I had to say goodbye to after 53 years. And it was an emotional wrench. It was traumatic in a way, that, in a very civilian way. You know, it's not war, it's not death, it's not cancer, but it is an emotional crisis, there's no doubt about that. And I say somewhere, I think, in the book, that everyone over 60 should begin to know how they're going to end their lives and where. And those who aren't yet 60 but have older parents should also begin to wonder how their parents are going to live to the end of their lives. These are plans we need to make.
One of the points you make in the book, Joan, is the fact that we're all living much longer now. I mean, it used to be that you retired, you got your pension, and you snuffed it within, you know, a finite number of years. Now we seem to be going on endlessly. What were the factors that precipitated your decision, finally, I have to get on top of this, I have to move? Was it declining health? What exactly prompted this big move?
My life's always been quite wayward in that I've been freelance, which means you work for anyone who'll pay you as long as it's respectable, legal. Perhaps not even then, I don't know. But I tried to keep the law. So I'm living in a big house. My children have gone. I'm a divorced woman living on my own in a big, I'm rattling around in a big house. There comes a point at which it's a Victorian house, it's on 5 floors. So I'm working in the top of the house and living on the bottom. And my knees start to give way. I went to see the specialist about my knees, and she said, "You're going to need a new hip quite soon. I'm happy to do the operation. It's very successful usually, and you know, I can recommend it. And I think you should think about it." And I said, "Well, I will think about it for a decade or two." And she said, "Joan, you're in your 80s. And I thought, yes, I am. And I was there within 6 months, and I had the operation then and there, and it was successful, and I recommend it. Don't do it unless you've got a dodgy hip. Just don't do it for the sake of it. But do not be afraid of it. It's a very successful operation. So I began then to be aware that, you know, and the stairs were no point in doing the stairs. And that's when.
You say that when people plan this move from the big house to the small, they tend to stay in the same neighborhood. So tell us how you went about finding a swap, as it were, in the same neighborhood, and tell us how helpful Andrew O'Hagan was. We know him up here.
Andrew O'Hagan, famous Scottish novelist, lives in a small enclave of studios. Now, the point about people stay locally because they get to know and love the area, wherever it is. People don't really want to move far from somewhere where they know the shops. They know the problems too. They know where they can find petrol, which may be somewhere distance away, but they've made friends with the garage. So they don't want to really move into a totally strange area. And they've made lots of friends. And Andrew was a friend of mine, and he took me out to lunch, and he knew that I was thinking of moving. I put the word around among a few neighbours. I was just thinking of moving. Joan's thinking of moving. Come to lunch. And he said, "I live in a studio, and there's a studio coming up on the market very soon. It's not been advertised yet. You must go for a studio." And but I'm not an artist. Why would I want a studio? What would it be like? So he said, "Come round and see mine and see what I've made of it. And because I believe that this way of life is exactly what you need." Well, I didn't know exactly what I needed, so I thought it was rather odd, though, of course, novelists are pretty imaginative. So I went round for a meal there, and he had a huge and beautiful room. He had a balcony above the main room. He had an attached bedroom and a small kitchen at the back, and it was beautifully done. And I thought, yes, he's right. I could live here. One of the things you need as you grow old and older is you need to be on one level. You cannot do the stairs. And so I thought, yes, well, if you're going to have somewhere on one level, it might as well be somewhere very beautiful with a very tall window, which is what the studio was. And that's when I thought, I'll bid for the studio.
There's a Scottish angle to this that makes it a bit more difficult to do this up here. I don't know how you do it down there. You'll tell me in a minute. But I've got a number of friends doing what you did or wanting to do. They have a property that's worth a lot of money. They're asset rich but cash poor. They go for something, they put a bid in, but because they don't have the money on the table, they don't get it, even though they're over what's asked for it. The particular friends I'm thinking about have been through that 3 times. Now, you had a different system in England, and you found someone to help you, didn't you?
Oh, I needed help all the way along. I mean, I write a whole chapter about how I don't know how to manage a project like this, because it is a project. And I do believe that as you grow older, you don't need to give up things, or if you give up the things that you're no longer equipped to do. But it's important to have projects, to do things, to have an objective in life. And I thought, this is my project. So what I did was I need to recruit a team of people because I can't do all this. I certainly can't do finance. I don't want to do finance. So I recruited, through my accountant, people who would advise me about the balance of getting in the money from the sale of the house, being able to deposit it for the studio, and it's called a bridging loan, isn't it? And how to squeeze the bridging loan so that it isn't so absolutely enormous. So I had a lot of people working on that to make sure that it coincided. But the skills weren't mine. I mean, the people who've lost out need to recruit canny financial wizards, because we're not up to it. I mean, I've had a life in the arts and culture and television. That doesn't teach you about money at all. So you have to trust other people to come to your help.
Do you have a blind bidding system in England?
Well, we do. We do, and I did do once when I bought a country cottage, and I think it's a nightmare. I think it's terrible. And gazumping and all that sort of stuff. I didn't have the emotional resources to deal with that. I didn't want to deal with it. The other thing, I was very, very blessed, because a big Victorian house in Primrose Hill, which is pretty central to London, it's 10 minutes from Euston, 10 minutes from King's Cross, I'm up here in no time at all. I paid £12,000 for it in the 1960s. And of course, by the 80s, it was worth a huge amount of money. So I was the beneficiary of a windfall, which was the property market. I paid, and when we paid £12,000, I have to say, we had a loan from my family, we had a mortgage, and we had a tiny bit of savings. So buying a house for £12,000 in the early 60s was tough on young people. But I ended up with a very valuable property, which I had not earned. That was to do with the property market. And I have a sense of injustice about that. I'd done nothing to earn that money. It was a windfall brought about by a strange boom in property, which is part of the system we live in. I even Ed Miliband made me a Labour peer, and I said to him, this really isn't just, there should be some sort of tax on a windfall increase in property. He said, don't go there, don't go there. But I ended up with a lot of money I hadn't earned. So when I bought the studio, I thought, well, I haven't earned it, I might as well spend it. I'm not going to be around for long, as long as I've got enough to live on until I die, which will decrease in terms of what I need, because I won't be going on fancy holidays so much or buying much. I will spend on the studio. So I went out and I said, I will pay what it costs. I'm not going to bid, I'm not going to underbid, I'm not going to do, just what do they want for it? There's the money. And then I recruited people and paid them to do all the infrastructure. But I was blessed because of this windfall. And I also suddenly felt, well, they're professionals and I'm not. Let's recruit people who'll be good at it. I hired architects, for example. I had a designer. So I ended up with something that suits me exactly as I want.
Open the front door and walk us through what you got. Tell us, describe the house, and there's an Arthur Rackham.
Yes. Now, the interesting thing, in the 1880s, a benefactor, a philanthropist really, he didn't do it for charity, but he certainly didn't set out to make a profit, an exorbitant profit. He built a series of studios down a little alleyway. Honestly, you can just get your car down it. And you've got to be careful of the wing mirrors, it's that wide. So you get down in your car, and there's a little square, and round it are a series of 10 single-story studios. And he built them for artists. The 1880s in Victorian England was enormously flourishing with, all the Burne-Joneses and the Millets and Rossettis, and all sorts of later people, actually, 1880s. And he put them on the market for artists. Now, this means that when you go into the front door, there's a little corridor, and that opens into the artist's studio, which is big, and at the far end of it is a window that goes up and goes on going up, and then bends and comes round onto the roof, as it were. It means that this room is full of light. It's full of light. And when my architects came to work on it, they made it so that it's a window that slides open, and there's a garden. So on the ground floor, in you go, down the little corridor, into the big room, slide open the window, into the garden. That's it. That's it. But who needs any more than that? Who needs any more than that if it's just what you want? So it suited me. And I matched the architect to the job. Do you see what I mean? I didn't want any fancy, I didn't want anything elaborate. The thing is, because of these artists did live there, Waterhouse lived in one of them, and mine was lived in by Arthur Rackham, who did all those wonderful illustrations of Tennyson's stories and so on, fairies and magic and witches and so on. He lived in the studio. And so I got his biography out, and I read his diary about moving into a house. He moved into the studio just after he'd married. He was in his 20s, he had no money. And he said, we're going to have to live in my studio because we haven't got any money for a house. But I think, he said, we could put the bed under this little balcony area. He said, if there's a child, we could rope. And he describes my studio and how they were going to cope as a family while he strove to make a success of his life, which it took him quite a while to become successful. And when he did, he moved up the hill into Hampstead. He moved up the hill. But other artists have worked there too, and quite recently. Patrick Caulfield lived there. The artist lived there. One or two, and there are now architects who live there, novelist who lives there. There's a woman who makes beautiful textiles who lives there. So we're an odd, slightly creative lot, I'd like to think, but not many of us wield a paintbrush, not professionally anyway. So it's been, the spirit of the place is very comforting. It's full of creative people. And if you believe in that kind of thing, I only just do, but the spirit of the place is about people being creative. I mean, it's not full of businessmen or financiers or people who run chains of supermarkets or anything. It's just people who want to enjoy the pleasures of looking and being. So there's a sadness attached to this, because you're going from a big house to a much smaller one. You have a lot of books, as I do. What do you do with all those books? What do you do with all the artwork? So you found someone called Fliff, and she taught you the 2 hours at a time rule. So tell us what Fliff did, and tell us about that rule. Fliff lives locally. She's a potter professionally. She has a kiln in her basement, and you look down in the basement, you can see all the white pots that have just come out of the kiln. My friend Jonathan Miller, with whom I was at Cambridge, had died quite recently, and I'd used to go for the Sunday morning breakfast with him, his wife, and his family. He had Alzheimer's at the end of his life, so we used to try and encourage him to talk. But his wife said he had to clear out the books in his room, and she recruited someone called Fliff, who's the local potter. When she knew that I was moving, she said, I'll put you in touch with Fliff, that's what you need. She did it for Jonathan, she'll do it for you. She does it professionally, you pay her, and she said, I'll only book you for a 2-hour session because beyond that, it's emotionally draining. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I just want to throw some books away. But she was very meticulous, and she made me think about every book. Keep, go, consider. Okay, so we've got boxes. Keep, go, consider. And she sat opposite me, and and I've got thousands of books, and she would hold them up, keep, go, consider. And she required an answer, sometimes the consider pile got quite high, but she insisted that we press onwards. And after 2 hours, I was absolutely shaking with the shock of it all, because every book had been meaningful. You know, do you keep reference books anymore at all? We've got Wikipedia.
Yep.
Who needs reference books? I need reference books. I love reference books. I like turning the pages. I like the size of them. So what about that? So some reference books went, some stayed, and some were doubtful. So she was a great support, and she made a difference because she shared with me the emotional tension of doing it. She knew that it was very painful to part with. I parted, I think, with a handful that I regret, but I don't really remember the others, and I cherish the ones that are still with me.
What did you do with your theology books?
With my?
Theology books. Did you burn them, or did you?
That's a bishop's question. Well, for a long time, I had done religious programs for the BBC, and I did a whole series called Belief, as you know, for 10 years. So I had to know a good deal about various religions, all sorts of interesting religions, and therefore I got the books. I think a lot of them went. I have kept Who's Who in the History of the English Church. Mm-hmm. I've got an annotated Bible, a detailed critique of the Bible, I can't remember who by. I've got a history of the papacy by Paul Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fine book.
Mm-hmm.
And I've now that I'm a co-chair of the humanists in Parliament, as you know, they are not, I don't know whether you would call them a faith, I call them a faith. So I've got books.
They don't like it, but they are.
They don't.
Yeah.
So I've got quite a lot of books about comparative religion. I've got Islam Explained. I think one just needs to have a book that explains Islam, because it's more and more important. It seems to me getting more and more contradictory, and we're seeing terrible things happen in the name of Islam. So it's, you know, the Taliban are Islamic in their extremities. So I need to know this. I just feel I should know. There's that strange compulsion, isn't it? I'm in my 80s and I think I should know about Islam. Why? Why? It's a fancy. It's a feeling that I'm still engaged with the world that matters. But anyway, it's that kind of compulsion. So quite a good selection.
You did a fair bit of future-proofing in your house, because one of the things I admire about you is you think ahead. And this book is about, okay, I'm going to be around for quite a bit longer here. So tell us a bit about the kind of future-proofing you did. You're all on one level, basically, so you've taken care of that. What else have you done? I mean, you've got a lovely walk-in shower. That resonated with me.
No bath. There's no point having a bath.
You had your last bath.
That's right, I had my last bath. If you're over 80 and you've got a wonky hip, you can't get out of a bath on your own. You can't. And I lived in fear of getting stuck in a hotel bath and being found there quietly freezing to death because I've not been able to get out of it. So no, I said to the architect, I don't want a bath. And of course, a lot of old people's housing now does not have baths. So there's no bath. So that means it's a smaller bathroom. What did I do to get older? I organised the books so that I can feed through the books I'm reading at any one time. I have a music set up. I still have a lot of CDs. I know it's out of fashion now. There are different ways of listening. But I've kept a lot of my CDs. So it's music, books, company. I've kept a table. My son, who is a cabinet maker, had made me a wonderfully big table that would seat the family. When we were all together, we were 10 or 12. And I've kept the table because one of the things about growing old is people have to come to you. You can't go swanning around too much. So I have a table and seating for 8 people so that I can entertain. So people arrive, there's music, there's books, and then there's a table. And the kitchen is there too in the studio. So we've got food, good company, music and books within a narrow space. So I can be there. And the lockdown was almost natural. The lockdown is natural to a lot of retired people because they don't go out.
And to writers anyway, they don't mind. We're just typing away all the time. But another thing that resonated with me was you decided you couldn't do Christmas any longer. We had that experience a couple of years ago. The whole family came, and by the end of it, we were totally knackered. I used to do a grand Christmas, and I used to relish the fact that I started planning it at the beginning of December, ordered the food, made the giblet soup and the stuffings, and it was all one. I had to give it up. Yeah.
I had to give it up. And there comes a point, and it's quite a landmark moment when you cede control. Growing old is about losing control in many ways, and I had to cede control of the Christmas to my children and say, it's you. You do the stuffing, you do the giblet soup, you buy the turkey. And I felt that that was a real loss, but it was essential to recognize it. We still have Christmas. I peel the sprouts, which I hate. I hate sprouts. Most people hate sprouts.
Why do we do sprouts at Christmas? What's the...
It's a tradition.
Oh, yes.
So I peel the sprouts and I drink the sherry. And the one thing I insist on, as you get older, if you're not careful, you will be looked after so well that you find yourself in the front room, as it were, with a rug over you, glass of sherry, and all the fun is going on in the kitchen. And you can hear laughter and jokes, and you'll go, what's happening? What's happening? And you're completely isolated. You've got to be careful. So it's worth peeling the sprouts.
A long time ago, when we had a Labour government, they appointed you in charge of looking at stuff for old age retirement, and you went round a lot of retirement homes. Have you got the perfect spec for, because some of us will end up in those places. The ones I see, being an introvert who doesn't mind not having company, I get scared stiff at all the jollity. I mean, are there any retirement homes for psychotic, psychopathic introverts like me? Or do you all have to play bingo and dance?
Well, I think a lot of old people's homes are very unsatisfactory. Yeah. I mean, I have seen, and they perhaps have changed since then, but certainly within 10 years, I've seen lots of people lined up in nice armchairs for the day in a room with terrible rubbish on the television, quite loud. They can't turn it down. They've not been asked. They're given tablets. I don't know what for various things, but sometimes I think it's to keep them quiet. And I think it's misery. And I do think that that's what I mean about thinking about how you're going to grow old. I think I have seen prototypes of wonderful establishments. I don't know whether you know a supermarket in London, not a supermarket, an emporium called Whiteley's, which was in Bayswater, a vast Edwardian emporium, rather like Selfridges, and created by someone called Mr. Whiteley. Mr. Whiteley left and died and left a fortune. And one of the things he insisted on was a retirement village being built with his wealth. And it's down in Surrey. I went to visit it for a television program. And it's a series of small cottages, each one with a little front garden, a little porch, and a tiny accommodation. And there are about 20. You can only get a place there if you're on social benefit. It's real philanthropy. It's real kindness for people without any resources. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's just brilliantly run. It has a management, it has staff, it has a medical wing, they have clubs, they run themselves. They're not forced to be jolly together if they don't want to, but they have various clubs to do. They can garden or not. If they don't garden, someone will do it for them. Now that, where is the Richard Branson old people's retirement home? What are our millionaires, billionaires doing? Don't go to the moon. Build a retirement village with your name forever. And I think it's a wonderful arena for philanthropy on a huge scale to leave that kind of home for people in need. They're very rare. They're very rare. I'm a representative of the Almshouse Association.
Yeah,
I think almshouses are wonderful.
Yeah.
They're quite wonderful. And you will know many because, of course,
Church did a lot of that stuff, yeah.
And they're very well run. They're building more, the Almshouse Association. And they're very democratic and attractively run. You have your own resources. People want to be both private and communal. And there's a prototype that was set up in Denmark in the 1960s, which is known as co-housing. Now, I only know of one successful one personally, which is in Barnet. Basically, the principle is you come together and say, we're all getting older, let's have a place where we can all be together, but we each have our own separate accommodation, completely ours. But we have common accommodation too. We have, if we want it, we have kitchens, dining rooms, social rooms, and so on, table tennis, whatever you choose. Co-housing, it's very successful. It's about 40% of the older people in Denmark belong to co-housing. I think there's a scheme that they're attempting to create in Scotland, somewhere in the Highlands, and I haven't followed that up recently since the book. It's quite difficult to do because of the cost of land. That's the real problem. Because what happens is that people sell up the property they have, so they pool the money, but it very often isn't enough to cover the cost of land and the building, because you have to have an architect to do it. So as a movement, it hasn't really taken off here yet, but it is a Scandinavian model that works very well, and people like it, and the old people are happy there, and their families are happy because the system is working for them. So I'm quite interested in seeing if that develops here.
Paying for all this is one of those hot political potatoes. And you say that people like you, who bought poor and sold rich, should make a contribution. It's a very hot issue. Talk us through the politics of this, because Mrs. May got into trouble the last time she had an election.
Who did it?
Mrs. May, Theresa May, remember?
Oh, yes.
She tried to visit the subject in a rather wooden way, and nothing came of it. It's a hard one to talk about.
It's very, very unpopular. I had a column in The Independent for some time, and I went out on a limb and attacked the idea of protecting your inheritance untouched to hand it on to your children. Yeah. I said inheritance should be subject to colossal taxes in order to make the lives of older people, to spread the comfort of older people. I was taken to the cleaners. I was virtually assaulted in the street, not quite, but I mean, it was such an unpopular idea. Now that resistance to the idea that your house is yours and will remain so, and it's your asset, hits up against the problem of society, which doesn't know how to fund old age. As you will know, the whole idea of social care is in the melting pot. Nobody knows how to fund it. Boris Johnson keeps saying he has a plan, but he keeps delaying revealing such a plan if it exists. How are old people to live if they are going to stay in their big houses, children have gone, no income, state pension? Where's the money coming from? No one knows the answer. No one knows the answer because no one wants to confront the idea that if you downsize, as I have, you get a lump of money from your big house or even your moderate house, and then you can put it in somewhere smaller, one room, bedroom, shower room, and live there comfortably with enough money to spare. These figures have not been worked out, but they're going round and round in people's discussions about how we should do it. And young people in their 40s and 50s whose parents are getting old are worried about this. Who is to look after mother and father? The political parties find it very difficult to say to people, you're going to have to manage on your own. Because what happened when the National Health Service was founded, it was said that it would care for you from the cradle to the grave. Mm-hmm. Okay, so where's the money? What it meant was it would care for you medically from the cradle to the grave. It didn't include that it would care for your well-being, your life. It wouldn't pay for the cost of running your life. That's what you do, that's why you have a job, and that's what you pay for, and that's what your pension pays for. But of course, the rate of your pension does not meet the needs that you have as you grow old. There is a huge resistance among older people living alone, very often, widowed, widower, in a big house, children gone, to downsize. They do not want to do it. And the political parties have said, you will not be required to do that. It's outrageous that you are required to sell your house for your care. We will provide it, and then they don't provide it. Mm. So there's a real dilemma. And honestly, it's going to take them years to sort out how to do this. And so I think the persuasive case, saying, as it were, if someone asked me one-to-one, have you explored what would happen if you sold your house? Could you break those emotional bonds? Could you leave the memories behind? Do you have to be in the house where your children grew up? Could you bear to leave that and start a new life? People resist it. They don't want to do it. And you have to listen to that. But someone has to find the money. And no one's come up with an answer yet.
I resonated with quite a lot of the sadness attached to getting old, and you and I share a love of architecture and buildings, and you talk about the kind of gestural egotism about a lot of modern buildings that don't fit the environment. London's studded with them. I wonder if you've been along to the East End of Princes Street, because Edinburgh has elected a golden turd on the top of the St. James Centre. The shining jobby presides over the old town. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I have heard a lot about it.
Go and weep or laugh or something.
How did it come about? Now, I've got friends who knew I was coming to Scotland, and they said, go and see Golden Turd, you'll be appalled by what is happening. What is happening? People are destroying Edinburgh, which we love and cherish. It's one of the great cities of the world. I mean, I compare it to Florence. It's a great city. So what's happening? How has that been allowed to happen? Well, I can't unwrap, but I think the word developer might come into the explanation. I think planning permission might come into the explanation.
The planners objected to that in Edinburgh, and it was
the council overrode them.
The council overrode them, yeah.
Well, you've got votes. I would vote against the Turd.
Okay, the anti-Tully party. At the end of your book, COVID hits the narrative, I'd like to reflect here on some of the issues it raises for the old. You've already mentioned it on what you do about the money you've created buying 60 years ago. What about another kind of greed, the greed to live on and on and on? I mean, is our generation maybe imposing too heavy a burden on the youngsters who aren't having the privileges that we had? They can't get on the housing ladder. Their pensions aren't going to be terrific, and they're keeping us oldies going indefinitely.
I think we're a very fortunate generation, because I had free education. I passed the 11 plus, and from then on, everything was free, including 3 years at Cambridge University for nothing at all. Scholarships did the job. Now, nobody's that lucky now. And we lived and survived the threat of nuclear war. We marched against nuclear weapons. We did a lot of protesting. I've done a lot of marching. My marching days are over. I marched against Brexit. That was my last gesture. I marched against Brexit.
The whole of Scotland marched against Brexit.
We have to look at how to... Yes, I mean, I belong to dignity in dying. I belong to assisted dying. I have spoken on assisted dying in the House of Lords, and I've looked at it in great detail. What is interesting, and I've been at the bedside of people as they've died. What is interesting is that the actual practice of assisted dying is intended to be that as someone is nearing the end within weeks of a very painful illness, it is legitimate under enormous circumstances to make sure there's no murder going on here, to up the dose of morphine so that they slip away painlessly. I've also been at the bedside of people who are dying, who are in pain, and are being treated by nurses who are experienced in palliative care. And I was in a room once with someone who was groaning. He was there because these were his last weeks. And the palliative care nurse came in and said, "Is he all right?" And I said, "Well, he is groaning terribly. He's obviously in pain." And she just moved forward and she increased the morphine. Now, one is called palliative care, and the other is called assisted dying. Now, they obviously operate to a different degree and with a different ideology, but I can't believe that these people can't talk to each other about our last days. You don't want to die in agony. Nobody wants to die in agony because of a principle. But the principle of hospices is also to make sure people don't die.
They manage the pain.
That's right. So I don't think it should be a war between people who say assisted dying is murder and the others who say palliative care is the only way. I think they need to talk to each other.
It's a big subject. You're going to have to come back because there are angles on that, and we're going to have to do a debate on this, maybe at next year's book festival. But I think we've got to turn to questions now. I'm a bit baffled by all the technology, so you'll have to excuse me if I kind of get this bit wrong, because we have two audiences. We have a live audience, which is lovely, and we'll come to you. We also have an online audience. And I've got to, here we are. I have to make this work and get questions. But while I'm trying to get this technology to work, because at the moment, Galaxy Tab A6 is confronting me, and there are no questions. So I'll take a question from the floor. Here, yes, please. Sorry, a question from the floor? We have a wandering mic. Anyone like to go? Someone?
I'd like to know what you think, not simply ask a question. Yeah. Do tell me.
Or a comment? Yeah, there we are. Someone there? Thank you for bringing this. We'll bring a mic.
Wait a minute, we're fetching a microphone for you. And you don't need to have your mask on when you use the microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. I think it's the most important, absolutely the most important thing we can think about when we're old. How the heck we die. Like you, having just seen somebody die in agony in a hospice, although the morphia was put up and up, you wouldn't do it to a dog. That's what they all say. But you wouldn't. And I made it my business to go around every single person in that hospice, whether they were a patient, a nurse, or a doctor, and I said to them, what do you think? How are you doing this? And they all said, if only the law could be changed. And one man said to me, you must do it in Scotland. That's the first place to do it. So I am just standing here, and I bring it up at every conversation I possibly can. I say, what do you think about assisted dying? Please vote for it and join Dignity in Dying. But actually, I want to go a step further, but never mind. Dignity in Dying for the moment.
Well, congratulations on making such an effort and having such a principled view and coming to a decision of your own. I think that's wonderful. I think we're frightened of talking about it. It's very difficult to talk to your children about you are dying. I mean, my daughter said, just can we not talk about this? I can't deal with it. I really can't deal with it. It's quite good to talk to your own generation. What plans are you making? I remember when my father was very ill and went to hospital knowing it was terminal, he used a phrase that was very old-fashioned. He said, Joan, don't let them mess me around, by which he meant keeping him alive for no end, simply extending it by a few days or so. And there was a rather touching moment because he was dying and we knew so. What is interesting about the dying is they sort of know when it's time. My daughter-in-law was expecting the first of his grandchildren. They were in Dorset, my father was in Manchester. And I said to him, the moment the first grandchild is born, they'll be on their way. They drove up with a two-day-old baby, arrived at his bedside, and lifted the baby into his arms. He was beyond speech at this point, but he sort of shook his approval. We all cried. I'm almost crying now. And the family went back home, and I said to my father, you can go now. And he died within 12 hours. He had waited to see that child. And I do think there's a sense in which you can decide to die in a certain way. The moment will come. It's time to go. So I don't think we understand or examine the psychology of it because, of course, nobody comes back to tell us. And we can't know. But that made me realize that he had stayed alive, just alive, in terms of completing the family, which meant a lot to all of us who survived him. So there's a lot of thinking to be done and talking. I did a series for the BBC called We Need to Talk About Death. And it was taken off the air just the moment COVID hit, which was rather unfortunate. But we did a lot of talking about how do we know what it feels like? How do we know what we will feel like? What assistance is available? So, yes, it needs to be talked about, and particularly the law. I think there will be another, from what I hear, there will be another proposal being brought in Parliament soon to legalise assisted dying.
It's coming on the agenda in the Scottish Parliament.
Is it? Yes. Yeah. Yes. Well, I think popular opinion is moving majority certainly approve of it. Yeah. Good luck.
I've got some questions here from the online audience. Does Joan have any advice for people approaching 60 who realize that they will need to do something about making their living space compatible with getting older, but who do not have the equity in a property to enable them to do what she has done?
Yes. I think it's an extremely difficult problem to solve. I think you need to have collaborative conversations with people your own age. I think you need to talk to your politicians local politicians, what are they doing? What is local provision? There's a lot of talking and reading to be done about this because there are different options, and you need to be extremely honest with your children and your people who know about your money to see how much and how well you can deploy it. I don't think we have to feel that we owe it to our children to leave our money to them if we need it to look after ourselves in old age. I think the idea of the cherished legacy, which is so popular in romantic novels, Victorian novels, the money that comes to you from, I don't know, Great Expectations. If you have money and you need to spend it on your own care, you must deploy it well in your own interest. These are your last days, and they are precious to you in more ways than your legacy will be to your children. So I think you have to be selfish about it to some extent, but you also have to be concerned with what is available in your communities. I should think it varies very much, particularly between rural communities and city communities. And I think that's also a political agenda. I mean, we know that there is not enough social housing in this kingdom, the countries, both countries, Scotland and England. There is not enough social housing. There has to be more social housing.
You sold it all off.
Pardon?
It was sold off.
They were sold off, yes.
Yeah.
There need to be social housing. It's a political commitment across all parties. There should be required to build more. I sit on a committee of the House of Lords, select committee on the built environment, and that is on our agenda, which is to do with the need for more social care. How to bring it about? I don't know. It's a political issue. We have to ask local councils what they're building, why, how, what provision they're making. We need to be heavy with our politicians generally, I think. We need to make demands on them. If we're going to vote for them, we need to know what we're getting in return.
Another question, when you downsize, how do you get rid of all the stuff you accumulated over your life? Did your kids come along with pantechnicons and take stuff away, or what?
Getting rid of stuff is both a pleasure and a nightmare. One of the things I did was I set up a little trestle table outside the front door, and on a Saturday morning, I started just leaving stuff on the table, and it went. So then I put more stuff on the table. I discovered that I had 40 vases, 40 vases. Because every time someone sent me flowers, they arrived in a vase, and I kept it. You never know. I was a child of the war, so I was brought up on the principles, don't throw it away, you never know it when it will come in handy, 40 vases. So I had this trestle, and I put out the vases, and they went. If you put out stuff on the pavement, people will take it. The Heart Foundation will take good furniture. Quite a lot of charities will take stuff. Old clothes and books go to Oxfam. You have to do a lot of toing and froing. I sold some of my paintings through Bonhams, one or two, fetched a small price that was worth doing, but I had to get rid of a lot of paintings. I had a lot of huge posters because of the staircase. Imagine a staircase on a 4-story house, and you can't put little pictures on so much space. So I had lots of posters, and every time I went to an art exhibition, I bought a poster, and I had it framed on the wall. Nobody wants framed posters. So I went on, do you have Nextdoor here? Do you have the Nextdoor app? And I went on there and said, if you were opening a cafe, or if you run a restaurant, or if you just like a look at a few posters, come round on 10 o'clock on Saturday. No, come round on Saturday morning. And someone texted back, how soon can we arrive? And people brought hatchbacks and sort of fed these posters into their cars and took them. And I think they probably found nice homes. I wanted them to have a good home. So you have to plan. You have to enjoy it, really. You have to feel that every object that goes is going to make somebody happy. And then you don't mind too much.
I think we've got room for one more, but is there a question? Yeah, good. There's you're coming alive. Questions from the audience now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether after the pandemic there may be a whole generation of older people that won't want to go into care homes.
I can understand why. I think the whole idea of the nature of care homes has got to evolve. It's got to evolve into a system that more approximates to the Whiteley village of retirement. I think people know the shortcomings of care homes, and I have to say care homes are run by wonderful people, dedicated, tremendously underpaid, run off their feet and underappreciated. So, and of course, the problem with running a care home is you can't make a profit on it without charging a lot of money and having some sort of luxury neo-hotel. So there is no provision. It's a vicious circle. You can't make a profit, so you try to make a profit by cutting the costs. One way of doing that is paying less, which means you get less well-trained people. So there's a vicious circle going on here. This subject needs to be revised and rethought. It's not what we want. It's not what old people look forward to. It's not what their children look forward to. They always do it with regret. What a shame we've had to do it, but we've got the nicest one we can, and that's the resolution. And I don't think that's an indicator of a society at peace with itself. It needs more thought about how to deal with the old. It needs imaginative thought. And I think the COVID and being in isolation was very interesting because I felt it was very like being an isolated old age pensioner anyway, because they don't go out very much. They depend on people bringing food, as people did to me during the early days of the lockdown. The other thing is that the social care, the people who care for you in your own home, these people are deplorably badly paid. They have to rush from home to home, and they're not paid for the time they spend traveling from one home to the other. So that's a whole profession that needs revision and needs organizing properly, understanding. We may have to pay more somehow to do it. Perhaps we could not have a royal yacht rebuilt.
I think that's a good cue. We've actually come to the end. There will be no royal yacht, but we have to say a very warm thank you to Joan Bakewell for a fascinating, instructive, and in some ways enlightening, uplifting hour. So please, Joan Bakewell, thank you for coming to Scotland.
Richard, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.